right, then moving on, we're going to part 7 of the feminism teaching. If you want to follow along, you can go to creationliberty.com, type in the word feminism, Feminism, and you'll find an article called Feminism, Satan's Plan to Destroy Your Family. And last week we were talking about the mainstream media lie that we're being given about domestic abuse and what's really going on, and how women are actually, when they are, in most instances of domestic abuse, about 70% of the cases on average, it's men and women who are both at fault for abusing one another. But in the instance of sole instigators, I mean the sole perpetrator, right, the person who starts it and does all the beating, it actually, women, as we've seen in statistics already, on average, are actually the sole perpetrators of being an abuser 2-to-1 over men. So it means that, and we've seen that as the man is the head of the household, has actually shown that the abuse levels are lower when men are in charge than when women are in charge. So you have all these feminists that are saying, well, if women ran the world, things would be a better place. If women ran the world, things would be far more destructive than they are now. And this is, I'm saying that from a biblical perspective, okay? And you're going to, and hey, if you want to try that little experiment, go for it. Doesn't concern me whether you want to try it or not. My job's the same no matter what. I'm going to keep teaching the truth. But if you want to try that experiment, go for it. See how many people suffer and die when women start to get in charge. So, I'm not saying that women can't be in positions of leadership. Don't misunderstand. I'm not saying that. Okay? I'm just saying if you want the world to be ruled by women, this is what's going to happen. So, last week we began to talk about one of the experiments that was done. Okay, it was a study that was done in which they were surveying people that had called the abuse hotline, specifically men who had called an abuse hotline to say, my wife is beating me and I need help, I don't know what to do about the issue. Because again, why are the men calling this hotline? Because obviously they want to stay married, obviously they want to keep their family together, they want to be with their children, they don't know what to do. So they're calling the hotline looking for help. And they found that 70% who called listed them as not helpful at all. And what I'd like to do now is read from this study. They listed out a number of reasons. They had asked men what happened when you called that hotline. And I want to read to you some of the things that that the hotline told these men based on their testimonies. Okay? One man said, quote, "They laughed at me and told me I must have done something to deserve it if it happened at all," end quote. These are men who are seeking help because their wives are beating them, and this is what they're told. Now, in the mainstream media, whether it's TV or movies or music or books or whatever it is, isn't it always the other way around? Isn't it always that they portray women are the ones that get laughed at and told that they deserve it or things like that? That's not actually what happens in reality. Women are given incredible amounts of assistance. If they said, oh, I'm being abused, people come running to her aid. The government comes running to her aid. They will destroy the life of the man that she points to. It's men that are taking this. And it's being hidden from almost everyone's eyes except those who've actually been through it. Another man said, quote, "They asked me how much I weighed and how much she weighed and then hung up on me. I was told by this agency that I was full of BS." End quote. Another man said, quote, "They told me women don't commit domestic violence. It must have been my fault." End quote. Because again, women can do no wrong, right? Another man said, quote, "They accused me of trying to hide my abuse of her by claiming to be a victim, and they said that I was nothing more than a wimp." End quote. Another man, very quickly, he said, quote, "They just laughed and hung up the phone." End quote. That's right. You say your wife's beating you? Well, what a joke. Deal with it, buddy. If a woman said, "My husband's beating me," and we said, "What a joke, just deal with it," and walked away from her, that's considered cruel. But when you do it to a man, that's standard. Because again, men are expendable, who cares, right? Another man said, quote, They didn't really listen to what I said. They assumed that all abusers are men and said that I must accept that I was the abuser. They ridiculed me for not leaving my wife, ignoring the issues about what I would need to do to protect my 6 children and care for them." End quote. They actually were encouraging him, well, you must be the abuser, not her, and you ought to leave your family. What wonderful services we have, right? Now, if we were in a society of this so-called male privilege, why aren't men automatically believed and given all sorts of assistance? Let's see here. Who is automatically believed and given all sorts of assistance? Oh, that would be the privileged ones, right? That would be female privilege. I mean, why don't these guys, I mean, how foolish are they? Why don't they just flash out their super secret male privilege cards for their super secret male privilege club where they get loads of free stuff? Women are the ones who are believed, women are the ones who are protected, women are the ones who are counseled, women are the ones who are helped, but men get ignored and laughed at. I mean, just imagine if this were flipped around. What if a woman called an abuse hotline, and the abuse hotline, because, take for example, last week we were reading about how what the men were having to go through is that when they called the abuse hotline, they were given a number to a batterers program. A batterers program is one where they teach men not to abuse other people. They said, we're going to help you get your physical violence under control. He's being beaten, and then he's being referred to some place that helps him not to beat people. What if a woman called an abuse hotline, they laughed at her, and then gave her a reference number to a local gym to lose weight so she could look better? You're probably just being beaten because you're ugly. And then they hung up the phone. Any of you would say, that's cruel, that's mean. But we can do it to men, and it's okay. Isn't that amazing? I mean, if that happened to women, there would be lawsuits, there would be media circus events, but when it happens to men on a daily basis, no one bats an eyelash. I'm going to give it another example from the Western Australia's Department for Child Protection and Family Support. This is fascinating. Now, on the website, if you go to it, there's an image on there about the Men's Domestic Violence Helpline. If you click on it, I actually show you both the women's and the men's. So in case you don't believe what I'm quoting here, you can look at it directly on there. Because a lot of people are saying, well, there's so many people out there that might hear me say some of this stuff, and they say, that's not true. What do you mean it's not true? I've got everything documented on here. Go look up. It's the Australian government official website. Go look it up for yourself. Now, there's a section of the website for women. It's a women's domestic violence helpline, and then a section for the men's domestic violence helpline. So at least I'll give Australia credit. They have 2 different help sections. It's not like America where, well, if you want help, you need to go to the women's section. At least in Australia, they have 2 different sections. But I want to quote these for you, okay? Here's the website for women. It says, quote, "This service provides support and counseling for women experiencing family and domestic violence." End quote. All right, so women are getting support and counseling for experiencing domestic violence. Here's the same section of the website for men, because they give a very similar paragraph, but they change it a little bit. The section for men says, quote, "This service provides counseling for men who are concerned about their violent and abusive behaviors." End quote. Yes, when you call a domestic abuse hotline as a man, even in Australia, you're going to get referred to a batterers program because obviously you are just genetically predisposed to be a violent person. Now, at the end of the page, they do say they have information and support for men who have experienced domestic violence, so I'll give them credit for that. But I want to take a look at the PDF fact sheets that they provide to give help, I'll put in quotations. Now, on the website, I took screenshots of these and I put them on there for you. These are the covers of them. The cover for the female section reads as follows, quote, "Has your partner hurt you? Information for victims of domestic violence." Typical, right? That's what we'd expect. Here's the title for men. It says, "When you hurt your partner, you hurt your children. a self-help guide for men who want to change. Now, there's a ton of stuff in there. First of all, when you hurt your partner, when you hurt your partner, you see, it's not about has the woman actually hurt you. And it's interesting, the two images, the one for the woman shows her curled up in a ball and she's all trying to like she's protecting herself. The man's image has his head in his hand like, oh, what did I do? This is what you get when the woman is attacking you. He says when you hurt her, you're also hurting your children, and it's a self-help guide. What if the woman said, this is a self-help guide for victims of domestic violence? Well, you're on your own, lady. Have fun. You know? Women are never on their own. They're given all sorts of assistance, aren't they? But men, if there's any issues of domestic violence, it has to be you, and you're kind of on your own. So here's self-help for you. Fix it. That's basically what they're going to say, too. Now, I'll give them credit, okay? To their credit, they do have 2 PDFs on the men's section. And I thought, okay, well maybe, I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I said, maybe they're actually going to address this. But again, as opposed to the first one, when it says when you hurt your partner, here's the second one. The second one's titled, How to Deal with Domestic Violence. I said, okay, that sounds better, but it's still a self-help booklet for men who want to change. Because again, it's pointing towards abusive behavior in the title. Now, some of you might say, well, Chris, I think you're kind of jumping to conclusions there, aren't you? Am I? Well, let's go to page 2 of the booklet, and let's read it. It says, quote, if you're reading this booklet, it's probably because you're worried about how your behavior is affecting your children, or you've seen your own behavior in your kids. You're feeling pretty bad about some things you've said or done to your partner. Am I overthinking this too much? Did I come to the wrong conclusion based on what I read on that title? I don't think so. It continues to say, you're worried she might leave you, or she's left you and you're worried she won't come back. Perhaps you have recently hurt your partner. See, it's accusing the men. Maybe she has left you. You might be overwhelmed by feelings of anger, guilt, loss, or fear about a future without her. Do you worry about the effect of your violence on your kids? Perhaps you haven't hurt your partner, but you're worried that you will. End quote. Yes, they actually got into the issue of thought crimes. That's exactly what's happened. Look, the introduction, that's part of the introduction to the self-help document, but most of the introduction really covers a mock story that they make up about Adrian and Philippa. And the mock story says, quote, Adrian realized that his behavior towards Philippa was abusive. Just because he hadn't hit her, it didn't mean he wouldn't in the future, end quote. Men are not only accused of being the only abusive person in a relationship when women are mostly at fault in most instances. Even when it's an even men and women fault, women are typically ignored and men are given all the responsibility and all the fault. That's what happens in most cases. But he's also accused of thought crimes. They're saying, look, you're a man, so obviously you're just genetically predisposed to be violent. Automatically. And just because you haven't hit that woman, it doesn't mean you don't want to and that you're going to do it in the future. Thought crimes! Welcome to feminism! Feminism is the reason why this stuff exists on government websites. It's almost unbelievable until you actually go and read it for yourself. And I encourage you, go look up all the source. I've got all the documentation on the website. Go look up these sources and check them out for yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. I expect you not to, okay? But in the U.S., we have an act called the Violence Against Women Act. And what that's done is encourage states to pass laws which have made it mandatory for police officers to arrest someone whenever there is a domestic abuse call. Now, what that means is that there's domestic violence going on in the house. Somebody gets scared, calls the police. It doesn't matter who it is. Calls the police. If there's no domestic abuse call, they go to the house. They have to arrest someone. That bypasses all Fourth Amendment constitutional rights of probable cause via a court-ordered warrant. They just bypass all that and say you have to arrest somebody. Now, there was a randomized experiment that was done in Minnesota which claimed that the new laws reduced domestic violence cases. Okay, that's what they said. Well, we did this experiment. We found out in this study that these new laws are actually helping domestic violence. But here's the problem, is when they conducted the experiment, and of course what they're going to do is they use that experiment and then they'll replicate that, or excuse me, they'll cite that over and over to different states to try to get them to pass a bunch of these laws, which a bunch of states have done. But the experiment they did in Minnesota was conducted while this forced arrest law was still optional. It was optional. That means it's not a law. Okay? If the police have an option not to arrest someone, that means the law, it's like the law's not even in effect. It's like nothing changed. You see, it means that the police were not forced to make an arrest at all. Well, there's no way you can get proper statistical analysis of a new law when it wasn't in full effect in the first place. Okay? The reality is that the law has actually increased domestic homicides. And so this is coming from a study from the National Bureau of Economic Research called Does the Certainty of Arrest Reduce Domestic Violence? Evidence from mandatory and recommended arrest laws, which says, quote, domestic violence remains a major public policy concern despite 2 decades of policy intervention. To eliminate police inaction in response to domestic violence, many states have passed mandatory arrest laws, which require the police to arrest abusers when a domestic violence incident is reported. These laws were justified by a randomized experiment in Minnesota, which found that arrests reduced future violence. This experiment was conducted during a time period when arrest was optional. Using the FBI supplementary homicide reports, I find mandatory arrest laws actually increased intimate partner homicides. This study, therefore, provides evidence that these laws may have perverse effects on intimate partner violence, harming the very people they seek to help, end quote. So the person who did the study actually has a good point. And the chart that I'm showing is from that study, that research that they did, which showed that the homicide rate, so you have like, the bottom line, if you're looking on the website, is family member homicides, which was already declining some, and it started to decline more when they did the forced arrest, right? So when it says family member homicides, that could be, for example, a mother beating a child, or a father beating a child, or a child beating a parent, okay? Something interfamily where somebody is abusing someone else or throwing things. It's domestic violence like that, right? The solid line, the one at the top, is the intimate partner homicide. So that's the one between the man and the woman, whether they're married, whether it's just a couple living together in fornication, whatever it is, like boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it is. That's what they're referring to. And you see the two lines, they're about even. The family member homicides was going down, okay? That's where people are killing each other. It was already slightly going down, but it started to drop more once the law went into effect. However, the murders between men and women started skyrocketing after they initiated that law. So, I'll get to why that is in just a moment. But first of all, there's many states right now that require police to automatically arrest someone. Even if there's no evidence there was a crime committed at all, somebody could have called as a joke. Or if the caller lied about being abused, they have to arrest someone. For example, a woman could call the police about domestic abuse, then after the police arrive, explain to them that she lied because she wanted to get back at her husband. But the police are required to arrest the man anyway. Now, to give an example of this, listen to this. Here's Alaska's mandatory arrest law. And I have all the documentation on there where you can look this up. Quote, a peace officer is not required to make an arrest under this section if the officer has received authorization not to arrest from a prosecuting attorney in the jurisdiction in which the offense under investigation arose, end quote. So what does that mean? That means the police officer has to get special permission not to arrest somebody. That's completely contradictory to the U.S. Constitution. So part of this is it's increasing the amount of murders that are happening. Now, if you don't understand that, I want you to just imagine for a moment that you have a man who is beaten on by his wife. His wife she's threatening him all the time. She's throwing stuff at him. She'll take something solid and hit him with it, whether it's a pan, whether it's a vase, whether it's something like that. He doesn't want to hit her back, because after all, that's what he was taught. And so he bottles up that bitterness and that resentment. He keeps bottling it and keeps bottling it. One night, she goes off crazy on him, just yelling, screaming, and hitting him, and tells him she's going to call the police and accuse him of abuse. When she picks up the phone at that point, his bitterness and resentment finally explodes into this anger, and he realizes he has two options. He can either suffer arrest, criminal charges on his permanent record, based on her word and nobody else's, right? No evidence, just her word alone. The fallout and blowback from his friends, his neighbors, his co-workers, and his family for being a wife beater, possibly losing his career, his home, his family, or he could just kill her and dispose of the body and take his chances to get away with it. Now, I'm not justifying that action, but in his situation, I mean, I would ask women, in his position, what could he possibly do? If he said, look, she keeps beating me up, all she has to do is fold her arms and look at the police and say, self-defense. Well, buddy, we're going to have to arrest you. I mean, what could he possibly do in that situation? If you think you have an answer, just keep listening, okay? I'm going to give you some more examples to show what's actually happened here. So, and it shouldn't be hard to figure out at this point, if you've been paying attention, that most women are not prosecuted for domestic violence. You got to stop and consider. She's brought forward in a courtroom. She's small, she's crying, and the resulting conclusion is, well, how could this little crying woman be violent? Case dismissed. That's exactly how it's treated in most instances. There was a United Kingdom study of the U.S. They were studying U.S. statistics from the International Journal of Criminal Justice Sciences. And it was concerned this female bias in domestic abuse cases. And here's what they found. Quote, mostly the response of police to intimate partner violence has been based upon the social position that the men have within the society. According to George and Yarwood from 2004, police have threatened 47% of male victims of intimate partner violence with arrest. In case you didn't understand that, they're saying that 47% of victims who could clearly be seen as victims of violent abuse from the women they're living with were threatened with arrest. George and Yarwood also found that the police ignored 35% of male victims, which means you could clearly see that he was the one being beaten up and it was ignored, and 21% were actually arrested instead of the female perpetrators. This is due to the disbelief that a woman could have been the perpetrator of this type of crime. And the male must be intimidating the woman to the point that the woman is attacking in self-defense, end quote. Because of women, they can't be violent. It's impossible for a woman to be violent. It's impossible for a woman to abuse. That's the general consensus in our society, and that has been adopted in the philosophies and minds of men because of feminism. The United Nations is also taking on their presumed responsibility because they think, oh, well, we have to police the world, right? Oh, the United Nations sickens me. But they're taking on their presumed responsibility of pushing legislation for what they call, quote, determining the predominant aggressor, end quote. What does that mean? Well, you see, that's training for police officers around the world to, I guess in quotations, analyze the situation in domestic violence cases. To be more prepared to discern things properly. What kind of discernment is the United Nations teaching? Well, here's the problem with this. Before I even read it to you, I'm going to show you that this entire list of attributes they give for determining the predominant aggressor are all biased against men. Here it is from the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women. What does that tell you? That's where this comes from. Okay? Gender equality. Unbelievable. Listen to this. Quote, police must be able to recognize the tactics of power and control. They must consider such issues as the severity of injuries inflicted by each party. Stop right here for just a moment. Let's say the woman shoves a man against the wall. Then the man shoves her against the wall. Who's going to take more injury? First of all, in most instances, he's bigger and stronger than she is, and in most instances, she's smaller than him. So who's going to take more injury? Well, she will. But they're both guilty of doing the same thing. But he's the one that's going to take all the fault for it. The severity of injuries inflicted by each party, the difference in size and weight of the parties. Gee, I wonder who that points to. The demeanor of the parties. The demeanor? The police show up, he's angry and bitter at what she's doing, and she's crying. She sheds a tear. Well, arrest him. Gender equality. You've got to be kidding me. All this is pointing towards arresting men. They continue to say, any prior complaints of violence... Oh, she's, like, for example, the woman can call and lie about it multiple times. Well, it's a repeat issue, so I guess we have to arrest you again, buddy. That's what happens. And they end by saying, claims of self-defense... Wait... All the woman has to say was self-defense, and he gets arrested. Claims of self-defense and the likelihood of further injury to a party, end quote. Oh, she's crying and he's angry. Well, it looks like we're going to have to arrest him because she might get hurt. He could be bleeding, but she might get hurt. What are you even supposed to say to that? It's absurd. This is nothing that any police officer should learn. And most police officers, I would say, have more sense in their heads than that. But you see, the laws that they have to abide by are forcing them to do what's against their better judgment. So, the U.S. Violence Against Women Act gives women low-income housing assistance under abuse cases. It gives them protection and free legal aid with pro bono lawyers who will oversee their case. While men, if they were... See, all that happens, the woman could be beating him, she claims self-defense, the government comes in, they said, we can offer to relocate you, to go to low-income housing, where we're going to give you discounts, we're going to give you protection, we're going to give you free legal aid, here's a lawyer for you. Men, well, even though she was beating up on you, you're required to pay your lawyer fees and go to court without legal representation, and you're on your own. What this is doing, this is what's called government subsidizing. When the government subsidizes something, that means they're giving financial incentive for something. And what this is it's giving women financial incentive to make false charges against men and lie about what happened in order to get special benefits that men don't have access to. I guess we call that male privilege, don't we? It's the privilege of males to be lied about and have their lives destroyed on the word of a woman. No evidence, on her word. And then women are almost never prosecuted for making false charges against men. I'm not saying they're never prosecuted, but it's rare, and even then, their charges are very light. And when we get to the section we have on the illusion of rape culture, you're going to see what exactly I mean by that, when women lie about this stuff, and they get a slap on the wrist if they get anything at all. I mean, there are men, we're going to see later, who could be thrown in prison for 20, 30 years for being a rapist on her word without evidence. It's happened many times. he can have his entire life destroyed on her word alone. And if the truth comes forward, and I'll show you specific cases, I will quote you specific cases where this has happened. When it comes out and find out, well, she lied about it, and they actually get hard evidence, like recordings of her saying she lied about it, and he goes free, she's never prosecuted. Happens all the time. She doesn't have to suffer any consequences for her actions. Feminism is what's brought that about. What I'm going to read you next is let me read you this quote. I'm not going to say exactly where this comes from just yet. Well, I got it from the South Texas Law Review, but let me read you this quotation. Quote, "A false accusation of child abuse is one of the gravest offenses one can allege against a parent. In our society, there is a bright line standard that if a child is abused, the law steps in to shield the child from the attacker. But what happens when our legal system is manipulated so as to trick a court into protecting a child from an innocent parent?" Good question, because that does happen. "The welfare of a child cannot be recognized when he or she is fractioned from a qualified parent because an opposing parent cried wolf," meaning that they lied, "and knowingly made false accusations against the other of abuse to gain custody of the child. And the shadow of allegation of one of the most heinous crimes known to man hovers over the wrongly accused parent for the rest of his or her life." This article presents the problem associated with the use of false claims of abuse to sway determinations of child custody in societal climate, where the occurrence of such an ill act may become more prevalent. It then examines the state of the laws aimed at preventing this malfeasance and proposes elements that a law should have in order to better determine and redress the making of false accusations of abuse in child custody battles. End quote. So yes, it's this person who wrote this is suggesting that we need to fix the problem with the system, and I agree. We can't do this thing where women just get to be innocent until proven guilty and men are guilty until proven innocent. That needs to stop. However, I was actually contacted by the author of this, and I agreed out of charity to him not to list out his name and where he's from on the article itself. But I never agreed not to say who he was on teaching. And so his name is Robert Kearns, okay? Robert Kern, or Robert Kearns is his name, and he actually works at the University of West Virginia College of Law. And he wrote me a letter, okay? And I'm going to read his letter because I want folks to understand some of the stuff I have to deal with sometimes. This is what Robert wrote me. Now, first of all, I want to make sure that he wrote me this just shortly a month after I released the article, which means the only way he probably even found out about this is that he's Googling his own name. He has so little to do at the West Virginia University College of Law that he just sits around and Googles his own name to find out the very few times his his research study's been downloaded, which is very few times, as I saw on the University of Virginia website. That's probably all he's doing. But he emailed me to say the following, quote, "I am writing because I noticed that you cited part of my article on your site. I am asking that you please take it down from your site. My paper was written for parents, male or female, that have been falsely accused of child abuse. It was not written as a paper that targets women in any way. You are taking my paper out of context, and therefore I am asking you to take the citation to my paper and my name down immediately. If you do not comply, I will seek legal action against you." End quote. I also want to read you my response to him. I responded to him the following. I said, "Thank you for getting in touch with me over this issue. I need to make 2 points. Number 1, you never said how it was taken out of context. Your accusation was vague, and you didn't bother to quote specifically what you were referring to. I went back to review it, and I did find a particular error in which the quote should have been placed 1 paragraph above where I placed it, so thank you for helping me find that. However, that wasn't the issue of context that you raised. The section where I use the quotation is talking about court cases in which there were child abuse claims made, which you would have known if you had actually read it, and I use the quote to help determine the point that false accusations are made and how the legal system is set up as a bias against those accused. Despite the fact that you did not target a specific gender, women are included in your paper, so the context is correct. You don't have to agree with what I wrote, but if you're going to accuse me of taking this out of context, you need to write me something more than some vague accusation. And then in parentheses I put, I'm sure you're familiar with the legal term libel. Number 2, I realize you tried to emphasize a lot of authority behind your asking, I put in quotations, to take the quote down, i.e., in truth, you're demanding it, immediately threatening me with legal action before simply asking, but there's one problem. You agreed to have your paper published in the South Texas Law Review, which is under fair use. So even if you had a case with your name under West Virginia University, which I would happily take down by simply your kind inquiry, in order for you to seek legal action, you would have to get the South Texas College of Law Houston involved on top of West Virginia University. So out of charity to you personally, I will take your name off the reference, and I will take down the name of West Virginia University, so there's no connection to where you presumably work, because I understand the real hidden reason you wrote me. Now, I didn't tell him what that reason was in the letter. I simply know the real hidden reason is because this guy's a coward, and he's scared to death to lose his job, to think that somehow what he wrote would be connected to accusations against feminist arguments. What he wrote is because the primary person in the relationship who is accused of abuse and is made to be punished for it are men. Statistically, it's primarily men that are suffering that. So I continued to tell him, I said, I understand the real hidden reason you wrote me, and I am happy to help protect you to some degree. However, do you have a particular law that prevents me from quoting and linking to the South Texas Law Review? The quote is less than 300 words, 214 specifically, and is obviously less than 10% of the finished paper, both of which are guidelines that have been brought up in previous fair use cases. If you do have a law that prevents me from referencing to and quoting from the South Texas Law Review, please respond with the specifics of the law and details to make your case clear, and I'll be more than happy to remove it willingly and completely without any legal action necessary. The changes I stated I would make in this letter, the removal of West Virginia University, and your name from the reference should be completed before you receive this email. I even went one step further for you and added a note to say specifically that you did not target a particular gender, which anyone who would actually read your paper would quickly realize. On a personal note, it is very interesting that this has gotten you so worked up over a random website that hardly anyone's ever heard of on an article that hasn't even had 300 views since I published it. Do you honestly believe this is worth your time? And that's where I ended my letter, and I never heard back from him again. So that's an issue where people kind of puff themselves up to think they have more of an argument than they actually do. He's not the first person to threaten me with a lawsuit. He's not the last one that's going to either. But you see, the problem is if he brought something like this to a court of law and he won, every newspaper and magazine in the country would have to shut down because nobody would be able to quote anyone. That's ridiculous. I'm not plagiarizing his work. I'm not trying to embarrass the guy. I'm simply saying what he wrote here was correct, his analysis of it, but he is so scared to death of these little girls at his college. He's not willing to risk his job for them to know who actually wrote this. I mean, I think it's pathetic. But at the same time, I can understand somebody wanting to keep their job and protect their family, the income he's bringing in for his family. So under those instances, I was willing to remove his name and exactly where he works. But I didn't promise him that I wouldn't say it on a teaching, okay? The point being is that that's the kind of thing that people do and they get involved in. That's how scared, though, these people are of these little feminists. There's no reason to be afraid of them. Well, you might be afraid of them if you're of the world and you don't have the Lord Jesus Christ, but those of us who are Christians, we have no need to be afraid of them. We don't need to be afraid of the world. They're going to do a lot of horrible things to us, but we don't need to be afraid of them. Because in the end, God's going to remake everything. He can restore everything, okay? And he can fix everything and make things right. And he's going to in the end. And that's what the Bible tells us we're supposed to edify one another with and encourage one another with, is reminding them that Jesus Christ is coming back and he's going to fix all this. So, anyway, now I've been told, and this is from reading some testimonies from, they've been testimonies I haven't really been able to get solid references to, so I didn't really include quotations here, but I've been told that most divorce attorneys in child custody cases actually instruct women that they can bring up charges of abuse. I've even heard that it's actually the law that they're supposed to tell them that they can do this. That they have to tell them that, or they can be sued for malpractice. I guess what you could do is just go talk to a divorce lawyer yourself if you can get them off the record on a personal conversation. They if you're friendly with them, they might be willing to explain this to you. I don't know. But whether or not the accusations are true, they can accuse the man of abuse against her children, which will typically win her automatic custody of the children, and it will get an automatic court-ordered restraining order against the father. All she has to do is drop the word abuse, and they have to explain that to her. I mean, in our current system, there doesn't need to be any evidence. The woman just makes the claim, and she's automatically believed, and the man's life is automatically destroyed because of male privilege. Now, I don't want people to get, oh, these lawyers are so nasty and mean. Look, if a lawyer is required by law to do it, then they have to do it. Okay? They're not given an option. I'm not saying every lawyer out there is necessarily evil or wrong. Now, most of them, we just can't stand them for the most part. I mean, there was a calculation that was done one time that if you took all the lawyers in the world and you laid them end to end around the equator, we'd all be better off. But the thing is, with lawyers, that not every single one of them is necessarily looking to do the most evil thing, but they are forced to by the law. Just like police officers, yes, there's a lot of bad police officers out there, but there's some good ones too, and even the good ones have to follow the law. They're doing what they don't want to do, but they have to do it anyway. Okay? So I don't necessarily want people to say, you lawyers and police officers, all of you are evil. There's some good ones out there that are trying to do what's right. There are some Christians out there that work in those fields that are trying to do what's right. Okay? But I would say they're not as easy to find in the way that things are going today. But anyway, I wanted to include this testimony of one of the surveyed male victims in a study that was published by the National Institutes of Health. And by the way, the study was carried out by 2 female doctors, so just want to throw that in there too. Here's what his testimony said, quote, "I have never hit my wife, but today I came close to doing this. It should be noted she has hit me more times than I can remember and kicked me. I grabbed her arms in self-defense and held her to the floor. I am a very big and strong man. My wife is tall, but thin, not strong at all. I know I will be the one who goes to jail, even though she is the one hitting and kicking. I asked her why she hit me, and she says, because you're bigger than me. I just felt vengeful for a second and slapped her back. It was the only time I ever hit her, ever. I cried because I was raised not to hit women, and I felt disappointed in myself that I had crossed that line," end quote. Because men are just evil and wicked, violent rapists, aren't they? That's why he went off on his own in tears, because he tried his best never to hit her. But women can do whatever they want, right? Get away with it. Because male privilege. I mean, it's sad that there are men who are that caring and loving with their wives. They're being arrested and abused and humiliated, suffering almost daily torture, really, at the hands of a woman for the sake, just because he doesn't want to lose his family. The sake of his family is what he's doing that for. A man is not to hit a woman, even in self-defense. Even though she yells and rails and nags and hits and bites and stabs, if he retaliates, he could lose his career, his family, go to prison, and there's no organizations he can go to for help. So ladies, again, I ask you, what should he do? What options does this man have? It's a rhetorical question, because right now in American society there is no answer. I just want women to think about it. I realize that all of us have grown up with feminist philosophy, but a lot of women have grown up being taught that they know exactly what men have to go through. I don't think women know the first thing of what men have to go through. And again, I reference back to that woman that I talked about before, where she did that whole experiment of trying to live as a man for a year or two, and almost committed suicide because she couldn't handle it. So, that same study I just referred to asked male victims they were the victims of female abuse, domestic abuse case. What happened during their last argument? They just simply asked the men, could you tell us what happened during your last argument? When she attacked you physically, what did you do? Here were some of the answers. One man said, quote, tried to talk to her about it calmly, saying, now, if I did that to you, you'd call it abuse. She answered that she was defending her honor, end quote. Defending her honor, that's very interesting, because when I read that, the first thing I thought of was the teaching we did. The title of the article is called Islam, a Religion of Terror, which you can find by going to creationliberty.com, go to the search bar, type in the word Islam, I-S-L-A-M, okay? And I've documented where Muslims have killed family members and justified it by claiming it was defending the honor of the family. An honor killing. In this instance, it's an honor beating, right? Which is exactly what they do in Islam as well. They beat their wives, and claiming it is to, to make sure to keep her in line. That's what they're taught to do in the Quran. Again, you go to that website, go check it out. I have documented it, okay? Not just what the Quran teaches, but also what their priests, their imams have said, in which they have encouraged men to do that. So this next man said, quote, I tell her that it is not acceptable for her to hit me or yell at me, especially in front of the children. I also ask her to apologize, end quote. Wow, what a threatening man. For her to try to be reasonable with her when she's beating him. How terrible men are. Another man said, quote, she refused to give me my cell phone and car keys and wouldn't let me leave the house. When I took the car keys from her, she called the cops, and I was arrested and convicted, end quote. Yep, this is what happens, folks. And it happens more often than you'd think. Another man said, quote, I tried to leave, and she hit me in the head with a flower pot. Then took the phone from me to prevent me from calling anyone, end quote. Oh, folks, she only hit him with the flower pot because she was trying to emotionally connect with him. Because that's what you do, apparently. Young boys and girls, if you're not emotionally connecting with anyone in your family, just hit them over the head with a vase, right? Isn't that the lesson we all need to learn? I'm obviously being sarcastic here. Another man said, quote, tried to leave but was prevented. I had been injured earlier that day and was not able to physically defend myself, end quote. Likely he was probably injured in a work-based accident or maybe a car accident or something along those lines. He couldn't even defend himself, and she was still beating on him. So, I mean, you have all these accusations. I mean, just imagine if a man was beating on a woman who was already injured and she couldn't even defend herself. You're like, that's horrible. But women, that's okay if they do it. Because it's just men, right? I have to laugh you gotta laugh or you're gonna cry. It's so sad. Another man said, quote, put my hands up to stop her hands from hitting my body and backed away, end quote. And one man said, quote, mostly I just sat there and took it and tried to act like I was above it, end quote. The study continued. I mean, there's a lot more examples. I only just listed out a few of them. They logged other male victim reasons. Some of the reasons included praying or writing in a journal in response to her aggression. Because obviously, when you're praying in response to her aggression, that's just a violent man who would do such a thing, right? Other men said they would attend to the children. They would try to calm them down or protect them from her. And then try to get someone else to call the police. That would be another option they would go to. Sometimes they would hit a wall or an object to work out their own aggression so they wouldn't take it out on her. Or simply cleaning or bandaging their own wounds to try to give themselves something to do to ignore her. I mean, his response to her beating is bandaging his wounds. What a violent person he is. Again, this is food for thought for ladies out there. What's he supposed to do? Now, of course, a lot of women who are very worldly would tell men and women that, well, just leave her. That's what the man should do. He should just leave her. And I think that most Christians would probably say the same thing. However, let's go to what these men had said. Because the study asked them, why wouldn't you leave her? What prevented you from leaving her? Here's the direct quotations. One man said, quote, "She spends every penny that comes in and has racked up thousands in debt. I would lose everything I've tried to save, or at least half, including half my retirement," end quote. Because she beats him, he keeps paying for her while she's beating him, and then if he tries to get away, she'll ruin him financially. Because male privilege. Another man said, quote, "She threatened to ruin me financially, ruin my professional reputation, because we work together, lock me out of the house, and tell the police anything she wants to tell them, because domestic situations being as difficult to ascertain as they are, men are guilty until proven innocent," end quote. This guy knows what would happen. And many of these men know what these women would do. They would flash a tearful eye, call it self-defense, and he'd go to prison. Another man said, quote, "I was advised that if I leave, I would hurt my chances of gaining custody of the children in the long run," end quote. He wanted his children with him. He wanted to protect them from her. That's what he was trying to do. Again, how do you think the Lord Jesus Christ views all this? How do you think the Lord God views all this? Do you think he's happy with this situation? All I can see is that the Lord God, his mercy and grace to be long-suffering with us in America is beyond my understanding. I give him praise for it. I'm not criticizing him for it. Don't misunderstand. I give him praise for it. Without that long-suffering, I would not be saved. But his long-suffering and mercy and grace is really amazing when we look at what's really going on in our nation. And you wonder why the Bible says it's better to go into the house of mourning than the house of mirth? There's a reason for it, folks, because if you could see everything that he sees on a daily basis, remember how we pray at the very beginning of our first half that, Lord, help us to see the world the way that you see it, not as we want to see it through our own eyes, but the way you see it? That's why. Because if we see things the way he sees it, we're not going to be laughing so much. Another man said, quote, "For better or for worse, and well, this was worse, I didn't care that she was too psychologically disturbed to love me back. I didn't care. I loved her, and I hoped I could get help for her condition before it was too late," end quote. She beats him, and he doesn't leave because he loves her and cares for her. Haven't you heard about that? You see some of these women who's like, well, I love him and care for him, even though he beats me. I don't want to leave him. Interesting that it's almost like we see that, and when men do it, they're like, oh, wow, that's loving and caring. But when women stay for the same reason, well, that's stupid. You need to leave him. It's not loving and caring in the same respect? I don't know, just a lot of food for thought here, a lot of things to think about. Another man said, quote, "I stay around to protect the children, exclamation point," end quote. He says, I am not leaving them with her because he fears for their safety. Another man said, quote, "She has promised to lie and accuse me of physical abuse against her, sexual abuse of our daughter, if that helps her win custody," end quote. And we are going to cover more on that when we get to the section on the illusion of rape culture, because that has happened. And we will see specific cases in which that's happened. Another man said, quote, "She's mentally ill. I know she's not doing this on purpose. I know she loves me," end quote. Now, if she really loved you, would she beat you? That might be a little self-denial. Finally, this man said, quote, "Concern for her well-being, she can't financially take care of herself," end quote. That's why he doesn't leave, is because if I left her, she wouldn't have anything. Wow, what a bunch of really vicious and violent men that you hear about on TV all the time. Actually, you never see these types of people on all those wicked TV shows you shouldn't be watching in the first place. You don't see these types of men. That's because it doesn't make them as much money. It's not as entertaining to see men actually being caring and loving towards the women in their lives. But for the crime of loving their families and keeping their oaths, these fathers and husbands, trying to be good fathers and husbands, they're being arrested and prosecuted at the full extent of the law because A woman's word trumps evidence in the American feminist legal system that we currently have. But from that same George and Yardwood study, it says, quote, in 2001, as a follow-up to the Dispatches survey, Dewar Research, a private research initiative in collaboration with Dr. Malcolm George of London University, blah, 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 all that stuff doesn't matter, they decided to carry out a further qualitative study of the domestic abuse of men in England and Wales and Ireland by female partners. The results are based on the responses of 100 male victims, 49 from England and Wales, and 51 from Ireland. Male victims face particular difficulties with almost no publicly funded support services specifically for them, and little public or official sympathy. Indeed, they often face antagonism by the police and social agencies, as evidenced by the significant proportions of male victims who are themselves arrested after seeking help. That's right. They call for help from the police, they call for help from helplines, and they're the ones that get prosecuted. A large proportion of father victims are forced to leave the family home, whilst their children remain with the violent mother, and subsequently face considerable difficulties in maintaining meaningful or any contact with the children. Now there's an important part we have to mention too. What about the children? The women are getting the children. The violent women are getting the children. What happens to them? Well, again, it doesn't matter. You get the father out of the home, they continue to have to live in a horrible home environment because the one who is actually doing what's right is the one that's getting prosecuted. Because male privilege. It continues to say the cumulative effect of highlighting the plight only of women victims of domestic violence, which I agree they do exist. I'm not saying that there's not women victims too, but the male victims are in greater number. They said highlighting the plight of only women victims of domestic violence in public and official policies over the last 3 decades, whilst no doubt helping many genuine female victims, has also clearly served to ignore or marginalize the plight of genuine male victims and their children. End quote. And that's why there's other women out there. I forget the name of one of them. It was the woman, I don't remember her name off the top of my head. She was the first woman to open a family, or I think it may have been one of the first women to open a women's abuse center, like a charitable nonprofit to help women who have been abused by men. I think she was one of the first person to open an official nonprofit organization for that. And she said I'm not sure if it was for women or if it was for children. She opened it first. I can't remember off the top of my head. Anyway, the point being is that she opened it for children and women, and then later she started to see where men were contacting them trying to get help for their abuse. And so what she did is she had a lot of experience in gaining funding for these women and children's centers. She tried to get a men's center opened up, and she could not get one dime of support from anyone for it. No one would do it. For lots of reasons. I mean, supporting women and children in donation, those incentives back on businesses and corporations, that looks good in the public eye. But if you're donating to a men's help center, it doesn't look as good, so it doesn't get you as much publicity, and so they won't do it. Because male privilege, right? Men are basically on their own, for the most part. What she had to do in order to get it done is she had to open up these help centers under the title a family center, which that's the way it ought to be. A family center, so all in the family could come and get support if they need it. However, she had to disguise it under that to get any funding for it, which is really sad. Our current justice system is following the whims of evil women into alienating men and destroying families without any burden of proof that is normally required in a court of law. There are women out there who tell the truth about abuse of men in an effort to protect their families. And that's good. You should tell the truth about that. But until we return to our basic constitutional premise of innocent until proven guilty, women will continue to get away with destroying the lives of men by crying abuse. And the Bible does not condone the beating of women and children, but it doesn't condone the beating of men either in the family. I mean, men that physically abuse should be prosecuted by the law if things get out of control and he's beyond help from his family. But women should too. And the fact is that women seem to be more prone to violence than men, according to the statistics. So where is the prosecution of the abuse of women? Where's that in the media? Doesn't exist very much. Not that it's not happening, it's not being reported on. And the problem gets even worse when we hear the stories of the girl who cried rape. And we'll see that next time we meet, when we start going over the illusion of a rape culture, because we do not live in a rape culture. And we're going to see what feminists are saying about how they're accusing men of being rapists, and we're also going to find out that men, surprisingly, whether you know it or not, men actually suffer rape more in the United States every year than women. And we'll find out the truth about those stats next time we meet. So, did anybody have any questions or comments about anything we talked about today before we close? Okay, well, thanks for joining us, everybody, this week, and may our Lord Jesus Christ bless and protect you all as you seek to study His Word and glorify Him in all that you say and do, and God willing, we will see you next week.